The spring floods had turned Silver Creek into a raging beast, a brown, roaring serpent tearing through the valley. The kind of storm that swallowed trees, bridges, and sometimes people. Ethan Hayes had learned to live with silence. His cabin stood alone in the Dakota Highlands, a refuge for a man who wanted nothing more than to forget the world. But that morning, as thunder rolled down from the mountains, he heard a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. A woman's scream. It came once, sharp and desperate, then vanished beneath the roar of the river. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought it was a memory, one of many ghosts that still walked beside him from the war. But when the cry came again, faint but real, he was already running. Down the muddy bank, across the jagged stones, toward the angry water that swallowed the light. And there, caught in the broken limbs of a fallen pine, was a woman, fighting the current with what little life she had left. He didn't think. He didn't pray. He just dove, and what Ethan pulled from that river was more than a drowning woman. It was a story that would change both their lives. A story of secrets, redemption, and a kind of love that could only be born in the wild heart of the frontier. Before we ride deeper into this story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Are you tuning in from the wide plains of America, the rolling hills of Europe, or somewhere far across the oceans where the western wind still whispers old stories? Tell me down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories of courage, love, and redemption beneath the open sky, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a good western tale. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you won't want to miss how this one unfolds. Now, let's head back to Silver Creek, where one man's solitude was about to be shattered by fate itself. The solitude of the Dakota Highlands was the only piece Ethan Hayes had left. He lived in a cabin he built with his own hands. Rough timber, stone chimney, no neighbors for miles. The land was harsh, honest, and quiet, just like the man himself. Ethan had been a soldier once, a rider for the Union, back when the country tore itself apart. He'd seen things that didn't leave a man easily. The smoke, the screams, the empty eyes of boys too young to die. Now, years later, he carried all that with him like an invisible weight. Every sunrise found him splitting wood, mending fences, and avoiding the world. People in town whispered about him. Said he was cold, said he'd gone half mad from loneliness. But Ethan didn't care what they thought. The wilderness didn't ask questions. It just let him breathe. Most days, the only sounds were the groan of the wind through the pines and the low murmur of Silver Creek winding through the valley. But that morning was different. The river wasn't murmuring, it was raging. The spring thaw had turned it wild, swollen with mountain melt, gnawing at the banks like a starving animal. Ethan stood outside his cabin, sharpening his axe, when he heard something that didn't belong to nature, a sound so sharp and human that it cut through the roar of the current. It came again, a scream, a woman's voice, raw with terror. Ethan dropped the axe. The old soldier's instincts roared back to life. He ran for the riverbank, heart pounding, boots sinking into the mud. And there, tangled in the wreckage of a fallen pine, was a dark-haired woman, caught in the flood, her life hanging by a thread. The water was a beast, cold, furious, and merciless. Ethan's boots sank deep into the riverbank as he scanned the churning current. Branches and uprooted logs slammed together in a deafening chaos of foam and debris. And there, clinging to the broken limbs of a fallen pine, was the woman. Her dress was torn, plastered against her skin. Her hair, dark and heavy with water, whipped around her face. One arm was tangled in the branches, the other barely above the surface. Her head dipped once, twice, then vanished. Without thinking, Ethan tore off his coat and gun belt and dove in. The cold hit him like a hammer, stole his breath, seized his chest, but he didn't stop. The current grabbed him, twisted him, pulled him under. He fought it with everything he had, his arms slicing through the water, eyes locked on the faint, desperate movement ahead. He reached her just as the tree began to shift, its roots tearing loose from the muddy bank. "Hold on!" he shouted, but she was barely conscious, her eyes glassy with fear. Her leg was trapped between the branches, the current beating at her body. Ethan took a deep breath and plunged beneath the surface. The cold swallowed him whole, darkness, pressure, the roar of the river in his ears. He groped blindly until his fingers found her leg wedged tight between two slick limbs. He braced his shoulders, pushed, pulled, nothing. He tried again, lungs burning, heart screaming for air. With one last heave, the branch gave way, and they both shot upward into the light. She gasped, choking, coughing river water from her lungs. Ethan grabbed her beneath the arms and kicked hard, dragging her toward the bank. Every stroke a battle against the river's pull. When they hit the shallows, he half carried, half dragged her onto solid ground. Both collapsed in the mud, gasping for air as the flood raged past them. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ethan turned to her, his breath ragged. Her face, and pale as snow, was streaked with silt and bruised from the fight. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Faint. But there. Then she coughed again, water spilling from her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, green-gray like moss after rain, and for a second she looked at him as if he were some ghost pulled from the storm. "You're safe," he said, voice low and rough. She tried to sit up, but her body trembled violently, the cold turning her lips blue. "You need to get warm," he muttered. "My cabin's close." She flinched at his words, shaking her head weakly. No town," she whispered, fear flickering in her eyes. "Please don't take me there," Ethan frowned. "Town's miles away. You'll freeze out here." But the terror in her voice wasn't from the river. It was something deeper, something that made her eyes dart toward the woods, as if expecting someone to come out of them. After a long moment, she nodded faintly. "All right," she whispered. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Ethan caught her before she fell, lifting her easily into his arms. She was light, too light, and cold as river stone. The cabin wasn't far, but the climb back up the ridge felt endless. The woman's head rested weakly against his chest, her breath shallow, the soaked fabric of her dress clinging to his arm. When he finally pushed the cabin door open, the fire inside was still smoldering from the morning. He carried her to the chair by the hearth and lowered her gently into it. "Get those wet clothes off," he said, tossing a blanket toward her. His voice was firm, not unkind, the tone of a man who had spent too long alone to remember soft words. She hesitated, clutching the blanket to her chest. Ethan turned away, giving her what privacy the small cabin could offer. He busied himself with the fire, coaxing it to life, then poured coffee from the tin pot he kept for cold mornings. When he turned back, she was huddled near the flames, his old army blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her dark hair hung loose, still dripping, and her eyes, watchful, wary, followed his every move. He handed her the steaming cup. "Drink this. It'll help." She nodded, her fingers trembling around the tin mug. "My name's Ethan Hayes," he said quietly. For a moment she said nothing. Then softly, almost as if the words cost her, she replied, "Grace Monroe." They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. And as the warmth began to return to her cheeks, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Grace Monroe carried more than river water and bruises. She carried secrets, the kind that never stay buried for long. The storm raged through the night. Wind rattled the shutters and moaned through the cracks in the timber walls, but inside Ethan's cabin, the air was warm and still. Grace Monroe sat wrapped in his blanket by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames as if they held the answers to questions she couldn't face. Ethan moved about the room, quiet as habit. He hung her soaked dress near the hearth to dry, set another log on the fire, and poured 2 cups of coffee laced with a little whiskey. He didn't know what to say, he never did, so he just handed her the tin cup and sat down across from her. For a while, neither spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them, a kind of uneasy truce. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and tired. "I'm not used to kindness," she said. Her words hung there, fragile as glass. Ethan glanced up, studying her face in the firelight. It wasn't the face of a pampered woman from town. It was a face shaped by struggle, sharp cheekbones, tired eyes, a bruise fading across her jaw. "Don't mention it," he said roughly. "You were drowning. Anyone would have done the same." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "No, not anyone." Then her eyes dropped to the floor, and she pulled the blanket tighter. He wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her posture, the way her shoulders hunched like a cornered animal, told him to let it be. Instead, he said, "You'll have to stay here until the river settles." 2, maybe 3 days. She nodded slowly. "I won't be trouble," Ethan grunted, unconvinced. He wasn't used to company, especially not the kind that came with soft eyes and hard silences. He'd spent too many years building walls, and now a stranger sat by his fire, cracking them from the inside. As the hours stretched on, she drifted to sleep in the chair, her head lolling against the rough wood, the blanket slipping from her shoulder. Ethan stood quietly watching her. The flames painted her skin in gold and shadow, and something in him stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. He pushed the thought away. Instead, he covered her with the blanket again and lay down on the floor by the fire. Sleep came fitful, filled with dreams of gunfire and river water. By dawn, the storm had passed. A gray light crept through the cracks in the shutters. Ethan was already up brewing coffee when Grace stirred awake. She blinked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Why do you live out here all alone?" He shrugged. "Some men weren't made for towns." Then after a pause, "You?" Grace's gaze dropped to her hands. "My husband died last winter," she said quietly. "He left behind debts, and worse." Ethan didn't interrupt. He knew that kind of pain didn't need prompting. "They came for me," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Men who said they owned everything we had. The land, the house, even the horse I rode. They said I could stay, if I paid my way." Her words trailed off. She didn't need to explain what that meant. Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned toward the fire, the muscles in his shoulders working like gears beneath his shirt. "So I ran," Grace whispered. "Packed what I could, crossed the river, and nearly didn't make it." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "Guess fate wasn't done punishing me yet." Ethan set down his cup and met her gaze for the first time. "You're still breathing," he said. "That counts for something." Her lips trembled, half a smile, half disbelief. "You talk like a man who's buried more than he's kept." "I have," he said simply, and for the first time since she'd arrived. Grace saw past the roughness, past the scars and silence, to the man underneath. A man who had seen death too close and lived to regret it. That evening, the cabin filled with a quiet rhythm, the sound of two broken lives learning to share the same space. Grace insisted on cooking. Her limp slowed her, but her hands were steady. The smell of stew and wood smoke filled the small room, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to peace. After supper, he sat by the fire sharpening his knife while Grace mended a torn sleeve of his shirt, the one with the faded Union blue. "You kept this from the war?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Old habits die hard." "My father fought for the South," she murmured, almost apologetic. "He didn't come home either." Their eyes met across the fire, two lives carved from loss, staring into a silence that understood more than words ever could. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The fever came on slow, first a chill, then a tremor, then heat. She tried to hide it, but Ethan noticed the flush on her cheeks. "Sit still," he muttered, soaking a rag in cool water. He pressed it gently to her forehead. She looked up at him through half-closed eyes. "You don't have to take care of me." "I know," he said quietly. "But I will." Her breath caught. For a moment, the world shrank to the warmth of his hand and the sound of the fire. "You're the only man," she murmured, "who's ever touched me without wanting something back." The words hit him like a bullet. He froze, rag still in his hand, and in that instant, Ethan Hayes understood what kind of pain she carried. It wasn't just loss. It was shame, beaten into her by the cruel world she'd been forced to survive. He stayed by her side through the night, watching the fever rise and fall, listening to her soft, restless murmurs. By morning the fever broke. Her breathing steadied, and as sunlight poured through the cracks in the wall, Ethan realized something had changed in him. The war had taught him to stop caring, but Grace Monroe had undone years of silence in a single night. Not with words, but with a truth that left him raw and human again. Over the next few days, the river began to calm, but neither of them spoke of leaving. Grace helped around the cabin, tending the small garden, washing clothes, her limp easing with each sunrise. Ethan tried to keep his distance, but he found himself watching her, the way she hummed softly while she worked, the way her eyes softened when she looked at the hills. One afternoon, he caught a glimpse of scars across her back as the wind lifted her collar, faint silver lines like lightning across pale skin. He looked away, jaw tightening with anger he couldn't name. Whoever had done that to her, he thought, deserved worse than hell. And yet, beneath the pain and silence, something fragile and dangerous was forming. A bond neither of them had expected, and both were terrified to name. By the end of the week, Grace could walk without pain. The floodwaters were receding. The road back to town would soon be clear. Ethan stood on the porch one evening, watching the river glint in the fading light. Behind him, Grace stepped into the doorway, wearing his old army shirt, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "The river's calming," he said quietly. "I know," she answered. For a long time, they just stood there, the wind tugging at her hair, the smell of pine and smoke in the air between them. Then she spoke, barely above a whisper. "Ethan, can I stay? Just a little longer?" Her question lingered, soft as the river's murmur. He didn't answer right away. He only nodded once, his voice low and steady. "The crossing's still dangerous," he said. "Best stay till it's safe." They both knew it wasn't the river he was talking about. 2 weeks had passed since Ethan pulled Grace from the river. The flood was gone, but its mark remained, deep in the mud and deeper still in their hearts. They'd fallen into a quiet rhythm that felt almost like life. He mended fences and rode the ridge trails, while she baked bread, cleaned the rifle, and stitched the tears in his clothes. At night, they'd sit by the fire, saying little, but somehow saying everything. Then, one hot afternoon, that fragile peace shattered. Ethan saw the rider long before the sound reached the cabin, a lone figure kicking up dust across the valley. Grace was hanging clothes on the line when she froze, her hands trembling as her eyes locked on the approaching shape. "Someone from town?" she whispered. Ethan stepped forward, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his revolver. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe not." As the rider drew closer, Ethan recognized him. Jed Mason, a ranch hand from the neighboring spread. A good man, talkative, too curious for his own good. Jed reined in near the porch, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Walker," he stopped himself, remembering Ethan's distaste for old army titles. "Ethan, I figured I'd check on you. Word is you got company." His gaze flicked to Grace, standing by the doorway, and something unreadable passed through his expression. Ethan's tone stayed calm. "What do you need, Jed?" Jed shifted uneasily. "You best hear this. There's talk in town. A man asking about her." He nodded toward Grace. "Calls himself Amos Monroe. Says she ran off with money that wasn't hers." Grace went pale as driftwood, the color draining from her face. Her voice came out thin and shaking. "Amos, my husband's brother." Jed kept talking, unaware of the knife his words were twisting. "He's stirring things up with the sheriff. Claims you stole a strongbox, Mrs. Monroe. Got witnesses saying they saw you ride off with it the night Silas died. The sheriff's forming a posse. They aim to come looking." Ethan's jaw clenched. "That man's a liar." Jed shrugged, uncomfortable. "Maybe, but he's got the law listening. Thought you'd want to know before they show up here." He tipped his hat, glanced one last time at Grace, and rode off, leaving behind a trail of dust and dread. Grace sank onto the porch step, her face hidden in her hands. "I told you," she whispered. "He won't stop until he ruins me." Ethan knelt beside her. "You don't have to run anymore." Her head snapped up, tears streaking her cheeks. "You don't understand, Ethan. Amos is cruel. He hated me from the start. He told Silas I was nothing, just some poor girl he should have left back in Kansas. When Silas died, Amos swore he'd make me pay for every dollar my husband owed." Ethan's eyes darkened. "He'll have to get through me first." Grace shook her head. "You can't fight the law." He stood, his voice hardening like the iron mountains outside. "Then we'll make them listen to the truth." They rode into town the next morning. The sun was sharp, the sky a hard blue that offered no comfort. Grace rode behind him on a borrowed mare, her posture stiff, her fear barely contained. Lander was the kind of place that thrived on gossip. When they entered the main street, every face turned. Men whispered over their coffee. Women peeked from behind curtains. Outside the sheriff's office, Amos Monroe was waiting. Tall, thin, with a snake's smile and a preacher's voice, he tipped his hat mockingly as Grace dismounted. "Well, well," he drawled. "The runaway widow returns. Brought yourself a bodyguard, I see." Ethan stepped between them. "Watch your mouth," Amos smirked. "Easy, friend. No need for trouble, unless you've got something to hide." The sheriff, Brody, stepped out then, a big man with a belly that spoke of whiskey and comfort. "Ethan Hayes," he said, squinting. "You don't come to town often." You here to turn her in or stir up more dust? I'm here to clear her name, Ethan said. She didn't steal anything. Amos is lying and he knows it. The sheriff folded his arms. Funny thing, liars don't usually have witnesses. 2 men claim they saw her ride off that night with a full saddlebag. You expect me to ignore that? I expect you to look her in the eye before you hang her with your words, Ethan growled. Brody's smirk faded. That sounds a lot like a threat. Ethan took a step forward, but Grace's hand caught his arm. Please, she whispered. Don't. Her eyes, glassy with fear, pleaded with him more than her voice ever could. So he swallowed the anger and stepped back. Then we'll leave, he said flatly. You won't find us here when your men come knocking. Brody leaned against the doorframe, chewing on a toothpick. Running makes you look guilty, Hayes, but suit yourself. Amos's smirk widened. You can't run forever, Gracie. When they catch you, and they will, I'll be right there to watch. They left town before the sun touched the ridge. By nightfall, they'd ridden deep into the hills where the land rolled wild and the stars burned cold. They found shelter in an abandoned barn, half fallen, roof sagging, but dry. Ethan built a small smokeless fire while Grace sat in silence, her hands trembling in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. He's not lying about everything, she said. Ethan looked up sharply. My husband, Silas. He wasn't just a gambler. He was cruel. She touched her back where the scars lay hidden beneath her dress. When he drank, he beat me. When he lost, he blamed me. And Amos, he knew. He watched and he did nothing. Her words came faster, spilling out like a confession that had been waiting years. The night Silas died, there was no money box. There was only a few coins I'd saved to escape. Amos wanted it. He said it was his brother's by right, so I ran. I didn't steal a fortune, I stole my freedom. Ethan's chest tightened. He saw her now, not as a fugitive, but as a survivor of a life that had tried to crush her. He reached across the space between them, his calloused hand finding hers. Then we'll face them together, he said quietly. I won't let them take you. Her eyes filled with tears. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for me? Ethan looked at her, his voice low and steady. Because no one should have to stand alone in a world like this. The fire flickered low, shadows dancing along the barn walls. Outside, the wind howled through the broken boards. But inside, 2 souls sat close enough to feel each other's warmth. Grace's shoulders trembled as years of fear and shame spilled out. And Ethan listened, not as a savior, but as a man who understood loss. When her voice finally broke, he drew her into his arms, and for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. Morning came slow and cold. A thin fog rolled across the hills, curling through the trees like ghost breath. Ethan stood at the barn door, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the valley below. He knew they'd come. Men like Amos never let go of their hate easily. And sure enough, before noon, the faint sound of hooves echoed through the valley. A line of riders crested the ridge, the sheriff, a few deputies, and Amos Monroe leading them like a vulture at the front of the pack. Grace rose from where she'd been sitting by the dying fire. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those green-gray eyes, no longer held fear, only resolve. It's time, she whispered. Ethan checked the rifle, then looked at her. You don't have to face him. Yes, she said softly. I do. She stepped out into the open, wind tugging at her hair, the hem of her dress brushing the dirt like the edge of a prayer. Ethan walked beside her, silent but steady. When the riders reached the clearing, Amos dismounted first, swaggering forward with that same cruel grin. Well, there she is, he said. The poor widow running again. Grace didn't flinch. I'm done running, Amos, the sheriff's horse snorted behind him. Let's make this quick, Brody said. You've got witnesses, Monroe? Amos turned, gesturing to his men. They'll swear to it. Grace's voice cut through the morning air. You mean the same men who used to come to my house to collect what you said we owed? The sheriff's expression shifted, uncertain. Ethan took a step forward. Sheriff, you ever ask yourself why Amos waited months to accuse her? Why he never mentioned the strongbox till after his brother was dead? Brody frowned. That true, Monroe? Amos hesitated, just long enough for the truth to show. Grace's voice rose, trembling but strong. He wanted me under his roof. Said if I didn't obey, he'd tell the town I was a thief. When I refused, he made up his story. The deputies exchanged uneasy looks. One spat into the dirt. That true, Amos? Amos's smirk faltered. She's lying. But Ethan's rifle was already raised, not aimed, just held in warning. Enough, he said. You've taken enough from her. For a moment the air was still, just the sound of the wind, the creak of saddles, the beat of hearts. Then Sheriff Brody sighed, shifting in his saddle. I reckon there's been enough foolishness in this county for one day. Monroe, you best ride home and leave this woman be. Amos's face twisted with fury, but he saw the eyes of the deputies, men who no longer believed him, and he knew it was over. He spat into the dirt, turned his horse, and rode off, his pride dragging behind him like a broken tail. When the riders disappeared over the ridge, Grace sank to her knees, trembling. The weight she'd carried for so long finally lifted, leaving only tears, soft and shaking, falling into the dust that had once been her prison. Ethan knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. It's over, he said. She looked up at him, the sunlight breaking through the fog, and for the first time since the river, she smiled. Thank you, she whispered. For saving me twice. He shook his head, eyes soft. You saved yourself, Grace. I just happened to be nearby. The wind rustled through the grass. Somewhere a lark began to sing. The land was quiet again, but no longer empty. Weeks later, the cabin at Silver Creek looked different. There was a woman's touch now. Curtains in the window, flowers on the sill, laughter in the air. Ethan still woke early, still rode the hills, but when he came home, he wasn't coming back to silence anymore. Grace Monroe stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd found what she thought didn't exist anymore, a place that felt like peace. And for Ethan Hayes, the man who once lived only in shadows, peace was the rarest kind of miracle. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe for more Western tales of courage, redemption, and love under open skies. Tell me what you thought of The River Kept Her Secret, and check out my other stories in the playlist to ride deeper into the frontier. Your support keeps these stories alive. Until next time, partner, may your trails be kind and your sunsets golden.